So we're going to first talk about federal regulations and laws and so forth. One thing that there are some other things I want to talk about, but again, I just want to mention what Jim mentioned earlier. But structural fumigation and fumigation in general requires a lot of expertise. They're of course very important to manage certain pests, and so it takes a lot of experience to use these products. And because of that, there are a lot of regulations. But pesticides in general are highly regulated in our country. So of course there's a lot of federal laws, and then also federal regulations, and then local regulations that you have to be aware of. So we're going to explore all the different laws and regulations, hit a few of them. I know that many of you probably are aware of most of these laws and regulations, but it's always good to do a review. But before we jump right into all the laws and regulations, one thing that I was considering when I was putting together this presentation is what is a fumigant, just so that we can sort of start out, since I was the first speaker today, just to think about what are we talking about here? What regulations and laws are we worried about? And that goes to what is a fumigant? And so I was surprised to find out. I contacted EPA to learn, what is the official definition, the federal definition of a fumigant. And there's not anything that's official other than what's in their guidance. And this is what the definition looks like. It's a pesticide vaporized to kill pests used in buildings and greenhouses. And then I learned, not too long after I found this definition, that through federal regulation, there's a proposed regulation that defines what fumigation is. And so this is the I guess newer, more improved definition, but these are not the official definition. This is something that's proposed, but it means any pesticide product that is a vapor or gas, or forms a vapor or gas upon application, and whose pesticidal action is achieved through the gaseous or vapor state. So again, this is something that EPA has proposed. It's open for public comment right now. So I just thought that was interesting how they've the current or the proposed definition. Now, then I started thinking about, what all different types of fumigations are considered in structural fumigation, which EPA often defines as anything that is a non-soil fumigation. So there's sort of, I feel like, 4 groups that you can usually put these different types of fumigations into, where if you're talking about a structural fumigation in residential or commercial buildings, a tarp fumigation, chamber, spot fumigation, or ship, rodent burrow fumigations. But if you want to group those into different areas, I was thinking about this last night, then essentially you're looking at the method of confinement. So if you're doing a tarp fumigation, you're confining that fumigant with a tarp, or the pest to be treated. So you might describe this fumigation by, okay, I'm going to treat for drywood termites. And so you have that way to describe that fumigation. Or the place or site to be fumigated, such as a rodent burrow, if that's what you're fumigating. And the last way is the commodity or the item that you're fumigating. So that could be grapes or grain or furniture that's not a commodity but something else. So those are like the 4 different groups that you can think about when you're talking about a type of fumigation or fumigation method. The other thing that seems unique about fumigations also compared to like other structural pest control, if you're doing rodent control or termite control, is they all look very different. There's probably a lot of expertise necessary and required to do all these different types of fumigations. If you're doing a chamber fumigation of an ag commodity such as rice, or a tarp fumigation of a similar product, in the middle there, rodent burrow, or of course a structure. Let's see if I can get that to work. Or a tape and seal of a warehouse, perhaps maybe a granary or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways, obviously, and types of fumigations that are going on, and I assume that you all are part of these different types. But then, in addition to the many different types of fumigations, there's, of course, the great need. There's to protect our borders. We have, a lot of containers, and I know there's a port here in San Juan, and just protecting from pests that are coming in through imports, and the number of fumigations or inspections or things that need to go in place to protect, and including the ships that are local. And I think I hit the wrong button there. Okay. So I wanted to first just get everybody sort of thinking about, okay, what are we talking about here? So that's, I guess, at least from my view, what we're looking at, fumigants, and then the different types of fumigations. And so when we talk about the federal laws and regulations, that's what we're talking about. So how are those products regulated, and what do the federal laws and regulations look like? And then I use this slide just to show you all the different laws there are, regulations. There's many different federal agencies, national associations that are involved in shaping how these regulations look. So it looks like alphabet soup, right? There's a lot of different acronyms and a lot to keep up with when you're talking about pesticide regulation. So if you think about just initially what's we're talking about here, what's the purpose of these laws? And it's very simple. These laws are meant to protect the public, to protect the health of the public and the environment. And how that is accomplished is through regulating pesticide registration, pesticide labels, pesticide sales, pesticide distribution, the transportation of pesticides, the storage of pesticides, the application of the pesticides. We're all involved in at least one or more of these aspects. The disposal of pesticides or food safety. So again, this is sort of the purpose of these federal laws and regulations, and this is how it's accomplished through these different ways. Just to start out here, the first law that I'm going to talk about is OSHA, the act that mandates employers to protect their employees from hazardous materials in the workplace. So this includes workers in pesticide manufacturing, but also pesticide applicators and farm workers. It requires written hazard communication plans, a safety data sheet for each hazardous chemical, and the training of employees on protective measures. So that's the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA. The Federal Endangered Species Act, this act is unlawful to harm any plant or animal that is listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered or threatened. So I looked up, and I know Puerto Rico has about a dozen or so endangered species that are animals, and I know there's also some other, of course, on the plant list. But EPA developed Endangered Species Protection Program in cooperation with the USDA Fish and Wildlife Service, and pesticide use is restricted in areas listed with listed species. So the product labels will direct you if you're making a pesticide application and if there's a bulletin in the area. So I'll let the local agriculture folks bring any specific bulletins to your attention. But now one thing that I wanted to mention is these federal laws, of course, regulate all pesticides. So we have to think outside just our fumigant world. Of course, we have the U.S. Border Protection and the Department of Homeland Security that have quite a few laws and regulations. And I know locally for me, since I'm from Georgia, the Port of Savannah is one of the largest container ports. So we have a lot of containers coming in, and the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection inspects a certain percentage of all these boxes, the shipping boxes that are coming in. And if they find a pest of concern, then it could be an actionable quarantine and require fumigation. So under APHIS, they may require certain process for, or a certain way to fumigate or some other measure to protect against that pest. And I know the manual, is over 900 pages, so there's a lot of information there. Again, a lot of regulatory oversight. But I mean, it's certainly important that we're protecting these pests from coming in, or you might be involved with an export situation. I know that, at least locally for us, if we're shipping cars to certain countries like Australia and New Zealand at certain times of the month to protect those countries against pests that we have locally, a fumigation is required in order for that export. Ships that are in a port, they fall under some additional regulations under the Department of Transportation. So the Department of Transportation does have some regulations on requirements if you're doing a fumigation of a ship. They also regulate certain hazardous materials that are in transport. So some pesticides do fall under those requirements. So we've got the Department of Transportation. And then USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, going back to the 1990, they put in place a record-keeping requirement for restricted use pesticides. So fumigants, of course, restricted use. This affects commercial and private applicators. But these are the requirements that are federally required on these records. But then you may have more specific regulations locally. So we'll let the local folks talk about what's required. But generally, the national standards are name and address, location of the application, size of area to be treated, the commodity or stored product or site is required on the record, application date and time, the product name, the EPA registration number, the amount, and the applicator name and certification number, or the non-certified applicator name if under supervision. So record keeping is really important, of course. It's important to keep these records because they're required to be kept, but also it could be for your own good, of course, to have a record of what you did or maybe what you didn't do. So the records are important. Again, this is required under a USDA under the Farm Bill. But of all the laws and regulations, really the biggest one that regulates pesticides is FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This act regulates more areas of pesticide regulation. It goes back many, many years, so this act has been amended many times, going back to 1947, but then in the 1970s, EPA was established to administer FIFRA. So US EPA does several things. It registers and licenses pesticides for use, and we'll get into a little more details there. But they, of course, are in place to ensure that both human and environmental health are evaluated when these products are registered. And they put precautions and restrictions in place on the pesticides to prevent adverse effects. Just a few important facts. EPA can at any time stop the sale and use of any pesticide. If they find through any kind of evaluation or incidents or things like that, they have the authority to do something like that. One thing that of course they're looking at is making sure that labeling and packaging are consistent throughout the U.S. But again, state, or if you see anything in this presentation that says state, then just think about state or territory or local area. Could always be more restrictive than the federal law, and we see that a lot, where states might be, impose some additional regulation. But really sort of the cornerstone of pesticide regulation is through the label and regulating the use of pesticides. And EPA, of course, approves these labels. They add additional restrictions on the label. But it is essentially the legal document, and I'm sure all of you know that the catchphrase always is the label is the law, and that really is true. It's essentially the federal law and how that product can be used. But EPA does reevaluate products, and we'll get into a little more details on the reevaluation. And of course, violators are subject to penalties under FIFRA. Pesticides are classified into two areas: a general use pesticide, which has a lower toxicity. There's no special licenses or permits required under FIFRA, but again, locally there might be some additional requirements. And I know in my state we still require licensing for general use pesticides if used commercially. And then the other product, the other classification, restricted use pesticide, which is defined as a product that may cause adverse effects to human health or the environment. That needs to be stated on all the labels. That's something that's required through the label process through EPA. Can only be sold to certified applicators if it's restricted use, and only applied by certified applicators or employees under their direct supervision. So this is something that's required under FIFRA. Again, that statement you can see on the right for restricted use must be on each product that is restricted. And it's not required on a general use category pesticide. Now, certified applicators are recognized by being competent to purchase and use or supervise the use of restricted use pesticides. And then through FIFRA, they're required to meet certain standards and go through training on pesticide labels, pesticide safety, and how to use the products and pest management. So they have to be trained. In some situations, you may have to take a test in order to get that certification. Now, certified applicators, again, are individuals that can provide direct supervision to other folks to apply restricted use pesticides. But as far as how direct supervision is defined, that's something that the state or the territory defines direct supervision. Now, every state, of course, has the authority to regulate pesticide use. So FIFRA at the federal level regulates and registers pesticides, but then under cooperative agreements, the states or the territories get a little bit of funding from EPA to regulate the use and license applicators and carry out those program requirements. And again, local law could be more restrictive. So if there are any changes in regulations or on labels as an applicator, that is your responsibility to, of course, keep up with all those changes. And I know that can be challenging, but coming to meetings like this workshop is a way to stay informed of what those requirements are, or being part of an association just to get that information. Because if there are label changes, then obviously you need to be aware of those and know what they are. As far as what is considered a pesticide, any product that claims to control, repel, attract, or mitigate a pest is a general definition for a pesticide that requires registration through EPA. And there are different types of registration. But EPA reviews every pesticide product that is registered federally, and when it goes through that process, they'll review the label, and I'm sure the registrants could tell us they often will require label changes when they go through initial registration, or if the registrant needs to make any changes to that label. EPA, again, must approve all that label language. But then what does it take to get a new pesticide? There's extensive laboratory testing. A lot of the pesticides that we use in structural and urban pest control comes from the industry, from the agriculture industries. But it takes many, many years, a lot of laboratory testing, and of course millions of dollars before any of that happens. So pesticides, just new active ingredients, of course, don't happen very often. So it's really important that we take proper measures and have good stewardship programs to maintain the products that we currently have, because it seems like that toolbox of products, of course, keeps shrinking as time goes on. But it's, I guess, an average of 6 years for this process to happen. Again, this is for a new pesticide, a new active ingredient. So before you actually see that label, the manufacturer has to conduct a lot of scientific tests, including toxicity tests, of course efficacy and performance testing, which is important. You certainly don't want to invest in a product or go through the trouble of using a product if it's not going to be effective. They also look at the degradation, mobility, if the product moves through the soil, if it's an insecticide, and its effects on non-target species and the environment. So the EPA reviews all this data. So this is what takes a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of research to put these data packages together for EPA to evaluate. And then when it goes through EPA registration, a Section 3 is what they call a standard registration. There are also minimum risk pesticides that are exempt from registration, like a rosemary oil product. If you think about some of those products, they could be exempt from registration. They can still be regulated, but they don't have to go through that same process. And then states can also request other types of registrations. If the pesticide use is not on the label or the site, then the state can request a special local need exemption. If there's not a pesticide registered for something, there's another type of registration that's called a Section 18 for emergency situations. So the reevaluation of pesticides is every 15 years under another law called the Food Quality Protection Act, FQPA, and they have to consider all the potential application of pesticides, whether, and not just the pesticides that affect food or the products that are applied in agriculture, but also in urban environments. So they consider all of those applications through a reevaluation when they're evaluating the risk. So all of the structural fumigants are going through this process now. Now, just talking about all the laws and regulations, we also need to think about what happens if you are in violation of the law. It is, of course, a violation for making a restricted use pesticide available to a non-certified applicator. It's a violation to advertise a restricted use pesticide without telling the audience. Using a pesticide in any manner inconsistent with the label, of course, is a violation. We all know that. But these are violations of FIFRA, but also could be local regulations as well. So, of course, the penalties for FIFRA violations are pretty steep. Most applicators and pesticide dealer managers, up to $5,000 per offense, depending on the size of the operation. Of course, that amount certainly can go up. Criminal penalties include a misdemeanor, commercial applicators up to $25,000 or up to 1 year in prison. So producers can be up to $50,000 and or up to 1 year in prison. So certainly the label is a law. We all want to stay out of trouble, and that's one way to do it. And I just wanted to just sort of wrap this up before we turn it over, and just looking at the future of federal regulations. And this is really important that these are all the products that are going through federal reevaluation. So you can see sulfurofluoride on there, methyl bromide. So these products are going through that reevaluation period, and EPA does look at incident data and different things that are going on out there. So that's why, again, training and product stewardship is important. The timeline for the reevaluation, it certainly doesn't happen very quickly, but it started back in 2013. They're hoping to be finished with the assessments in 2018, and then we should hear a decision, I guess, by sometime in 2019. But they're currently working with registrants on developing protocols for studies that they've requested to do the risk reevaluations. They're discussing the specifics of methods of application for active ingredients with registrants and stakeholders. They're discussing this process with the different stakeholders, and we certainly have seen EPA doing this. They've reached out to ASPRO, I know. We worked with NPMA earlier this year to host a structural fumigation workshop for the EPA risk evaluators, so that when they are looking at the risks and evaluating them, they know how you're using the products. And if they don't understand how the products are used or the need that they're the needs that they're needed for, then they make assumptions that might not be such good assumptions. They might I don't know what I'm trying to say, but anyways, make bad decisions because they don't have that knowledge. And we certainly saw that. I know, like at my state, structural fumigations where they tent a structure, they thought that we were doing thousands of those every year, and at the end of the day, we're only doing about 50 to 75 a year. So they got an idea. Okay, well that's not the number that they were initially thinking about. One thing that they have announced is that they're looking at fumigation management plans for the structural fumigants. So that would be a possibility. We might see that being a requirement when it goes through this process. The methyl bromide, they accepted some label amendments just recently in September on the commodity and quarantine labels. So this will affect bystander and worker risk mitigation measures. And there's also some new front panel language that strictly prohibits the use in residential areas. So these are, so there will be some new methyl bromide labels coming out, and I'm sure that the other experts here will be talking about that in a little more detail. I mentioned this earlier, but this is really one of the biggest things that's happening in federal regulation of pesticides. But EPA has proposed new certification and training standards. And specifically, some of the things that they're proposing is to require non-soil fumigation categories, so states and territories, if they don't already have one, would have to create one. Some new recertification training requirements, and then also non-commercial applicator training requirements. So this is, it's really a big deal. It's just proposed regulations right now. There's, like I mentioned, there's the definition of fumigation. So we're going to see, obviously, some changes in the future on certification and training requirements. We just don't know what that will look like yet. So again, as far as the future of pesticides is certainly the regulatory environment is certainly not going to go away. We're probably just going to see some additional restrictions that we just need to be aware of and follow what's going on. Follow what's going on. Follow what's going on. Follow what's going on. Follow what's